I'm Jack DeMille, the armless chair historian. With the British, French, and German empires all having extensive colonies in Africa during the First World War, it should come as no surprise there was extensive fighting there. Although soldiers deployed in the African theater weren't subject to the gruesome same frontal charges and long month of trench warfare found in Europe, the soldiers fighting in Africa had their own set of problems to contend with. Hostile terrain, lack of infrastructure, and a constant shortage of supplies made combat there uniquely prolonged, miserable, and deadly. When the Great War broke out in the summer of 1914, the governing leaders of colonial Africa received the news with considerably less enthusiasm than their countrymen back home. While the territories claimed by Europe's imperial powers appeared vast and menacing, much of the land was only held in name, with many native Africans living in small, remote communities, still answering to their local kings and chiefs. Thus, many colonial governors feared that being drawn into a global conflict would weaken or break their already tenuous hold over the continent. At the beginning of the war, many administrators and journalists in Africa declared that the colonies should remain neutral and continue to cooperate with each other to consolidate their power in the region. This commitment to neutrality was powerful, managed to last a whole 1 week before France and Britain ordered their colonial armies to start invading German colonies. The first shots were fired by the French, invading German Cameroon on August 6, 1914. The next day, Allied forces invaded Togoland, and German forces in East Africa began invading nearby colonies. While Togoland would surrender in only 3 weeks, with minimal resistance, the defenders of Cameroon put up a stubborn fight. Though British or French forces were able to quickly occupy much of the colony, the mountainous terrain of central Cameroon proved highly defensible, letting the Germans hold back the Allied forces for more than a year, repelling assault after assault on the provisional capital of Yaoundé. Meanwhile, in response to the German raids, the British began to prepare an amphibious invasion of German East Africa, beginning with the capture of the port of Tonga in November. Tonga was sparsely defended, so the Allies expected an easy victory, but their efforts would be complicated by fierce enemy resistance. And of all things, bees. More on that later. Not long after fighting broke out in the northwest, the British Union of South Africa mobilized its forces for what should have been a quick and easy invasion of German Southwest Africa. The South African army outnumbered the German garrison 20-1, and on September 14, 1914, they invaded and rapidly began to occupy the colony. However, the British rulers of South Africa soon found their efforts complicated, as always, by the Boers. Descendants of Dutch settlers in the region, the Boers had long resented the British rule in the region, and tensions between the two groups were high. On the day after the invasion began, Boer politician and former general of the Second Boer War, Quos de la Rey, was unlawfully shot dead by a British policeman at a roadblock. In response, one of the commanding officers leading the invasion of Southwest Africa, Lieutenant Colonel Monte Moritz, defected, leading the soldiers under his command in a rebellion against the British South African government. The rebellion threw the South African army into disarray, and command was turned over to General Jan Smuts, a seasoned British officer, in hopes that he could restore order. Smuts declared martial law in South Africa and halted the invasion order to deal with the rebellion. The process of putting down the uprising and rounding up war rebels kept Smuts occupied for the rest of 1914, giving the small German garrison precious time to regroup. Meanwhile, north of the Sahara, all territories seemed to be held firmly in the hands of the Entente and neutral Italians, but the absence of German colonies did not protect North Africa from the influence of the Great War. The diversions of troops to the Western Front left European colonies in North Africa vulnerable to rebellions, which the Germans and Ottoman empires were more than happy to aid. In the French protectorate of Morocco, fighting was already ongoing between the colonial forces and the Zayn Confederation, an alliance of Berber tribes that opposed French attempts to consolidate power in the Middle Atlas Mountains. Most of the troops in Morocco had been recalled to defend France, so the remaining troops there had to be stretched dangerously thin across the French line to hide the sudden vulnerability. While one hot-headed officer nearly doomed the French defense by marching off and getting his force annihilated in November, the Zayns never committed to an organized offensive, and the fragile French line managed to hold on for the rest of the war. Nearing the end of 1914, the British launched their invasion of German East Africa. Their first target was the port city of Tonga. On paper, capturing the city should have been easy. The British brought 4,000 men to battle compared to the German garrison of only 250 conscripts. However, the British blundered at nearly every stage of the battle. First, Commander Arthur Aiken made the chivalrous decision to announce himself to the Germans and give them an hour to surrender the city before even landing his troops, giving German General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck plenty of time to rush to Tonga with 750 reinforcements. Perhaps hoping to make up for lost time, Aiken ordered his troops to attack as soon as they hit the shore, despite their exhaustion after the long journey all the way from India. While the British seemingly did everything in their power to lose their own battle, the Germans helped, taking the attackers by surprise with their well-concealed and fortified defensive positions. Additionally, Mother Nature contributed to the British defeat, sending swarms of agitated bees into the fighting. Even after 5,000 additional troops arrived to reinforce the flagging assault, but the men were continually plagued by poor morale, and after suffering nearly 1,000 casualties, they were forced to retreat from Tonga. The Germans barely suffered 100 casualties and were able to loot plenty of medical supplies, equipment, and Maxim guns from their defeated foes, effectively supplying them for the rest of the campaign. Tonga was later described by historian Charles Horden as one of the most notable failures in British military history, and it effectively halted the invasion of German East Africa for the following year. As 1915 began, fighting continued to rage in Cameroon, and French troops would unsuccessfully besiege the capital, while British forces were bogged down in the north by stubborn German resistance of two strongholds known as Mora and Garoua. These old-fashioned stone fortresses, long since rendered obsolete in Europe, were still extremely effective in the undeveloped landscape of Cameroon, where heavy artillery was unavailable. Down in southwest Africa, the tiny German garrison took advantage of the chaos caused by the Moritz situation to turn the tables on the South African army. They routed the small occupying garrison and reclaimed their captured territory, and in February invaded South Africa and attempted to gain control of two forts at the Orange River. This daring German attack was repelled, and 1 week later, the South Africans resumed their invasion. With the full attention of the massive South African army at last, the Germans were forced into a rapid retreat and surrendered on July 9, 1915. In November, the British Protectorate of Egypt was taken by surprise when the Senussi Order, a secretive religious order based in Libya, invaded with 10,000 men and modern weapons provided by the Ottoman Empire. The Senussis quickly gained ground in Egypt and attempted to rally the local Muslim population to join them against the British. Unfortunately, for the would-be holy warriors, local support failed to materialize, and the British soon began pushing back the invasion. Skirmishes along the border would continue for years, but the bulk of the Senussi army was decisively defeated at the Battle of... don't know how to pronounce that. I'm moving on. Around the same time, the staunch German resistance in Cameroon was finally starting to collapse, and British and French forces were closing in on the capital. Seeing the writing on the wall, the German commander Karl Zimmermann ordered all German soldiers and civilians to abandon Cameroon and retreat to the neighboring Spanish colony of Rio Muni. Zimmermann's retreat functionally ended the campaign, at which time Britain and France agreed on the terms to divide up Cameroon amongst themselves. After the conclusion of this campaign, the British turned their attention to East Africa, and its now infamous commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. In January of 1916, General Jan Smuts was reassigned from the south and given an army of 20,000 men to finally conquer German East Africa. This was a massive force for the African theater, requiring hundreds of thousands of African porters to carry weapons, ammunition, and other vital supplies through the harsh landscape of East Africa. The British Army then launched their second invasion of German East Africa in February, joined by a Belgian force coming from the Congo in the west. Much like in Cameroon, the Germans quickly lost ground against the more numerous invaders, but Lettow-Vorbeck was determined to make the Allies pay dearly for every mile. Using the thick brush and forest as cover, he launched repeated hit-and-run ambushes against the British as he withdrew. Slowly whittling down their forces, the raids were successful in harassing the Allied armies and slowing them down, giving tropical diseases all the more time to wreak havoc on the Commonwealth forces. The invasion dragged on this way for the rest of 1916, with attrition devastating the British forces as they slowly trudged further and further into East Africa. Rather than abandon this costly campaign, the British chose to make up their losses with more and more African conscripts. By the beginning of 1917, more than half the army in East Africa consisted of local African troops, forcibly recruited from across the continent to shore up the faltering defensive. As for Lettow Vorbeck, he continued his fighting retreat all the way through 1917, consistently avoiding British attempts to encircle his dwindling army. By November, the Germans had been pushed back all the way to the Rovuma River, the southern border of the colony, and were low on supplies and ammunition. Rather than surrender, Lettow chose to cross the river and invade the poorly defended Portuguese colony of Mozambique. While the Allies were able to fully occupy German East Africa, the German army continued to make a nuisance of itself in the Portuguese colony for 9 months, raiding and pillaging it for supplies. In August 1918, they finally returned to the colony and began to retake lost territory from the pitifully small German garrisons now defending it. This fighting would continue until November, when Lettow Vorbeck finally surrendered upon hearing word that an armistice had been signed and the German Empire had lost the war. All told, the war in Africa claimed the lives of far fewer soldiers than it did in Europe. The Allies suffered around 42,000 military casualties, while the Germans suffered around 21,000. The civilian cost was much, much higher. It's estimated that 1 million Africans were conscripted as porters to support the campaign, and more than 100,000 died. This caused severe depopulation of many regions. For example, 45,000 porters were recruited from Kenya, amounting to 13% of the male population. Combined with the constant raiding and requisitioning, a polite word for raiding, of local crops and cattle by both sides, the European campaigns led to massive famine in East Africa in 1917, which claimed another 300,000 civilian lives. As is so often the case, the price of war in Africa was paid most heavily by the civilians. Germany's colonies in the region were seized and were divided up among the British and French along arbitrary lines. Even so, the First World War was the first time that the cracks began to show in the facade of European invincibility, paving the way for uprisings against colonial rule. These cracks would only continue to grow in the years to come before the whole structure of colonialism finally collapsed after the Second World War.